Chapter 2645. The more you learn, turn off. Reset. The bombardment of the night garden descended on the northern span of the Great Bridge, carving bloody paths in the tide of hideous flesh. A bloody haze drifted above the vast chasm, and pieces of Tom bodies rained down. Saint retreated just in time to avoid being swept away in the lethal barrage, sliding back on the slick stone while plunging her sword into it to arrest her momentum. A split second later, she regained her balance and lunged forward, cutting down one of the fallen immortals who had escaped the first salvo of the night garden. Due to her monumental height, she looked like a towering statue from a distance. Fiend was at least 4 times higher at that moment. However, his fearsome figure suddenly shrank, becoming only a head taller than her. His mass remained the same, though, so when he lunged forward to join Saint, the great bridge trembled and trembled. Together, they massacred the vanguard of the immortal swarm. Fire and darkness intertwined like a primal inferno, reminding Sunny of the ancient murals depicting the flames of desire burning in the everlasting void. The Shadow Legion advanced. With the night garden bombarding the bridge, it was as if the roots of the immortal swarm had been cut. The grotesque nightmare creatures were still swiftly rising from the dead, but since the massive cannonballs continued to decimate them, fewer managed to reach the line of battle contact intact, and because of that, the balance of power between them and the silent shades shifted. With fewer enemies to deal with, Saint and her army were able to restrain them faster, and once they gained that advantage, their progress snowballed. Standing on the deck of the night garden, Neve observed the distant battle with a stunned expression. This was his first time witnessing the Shadow Legion or any sovereign going all out, for that matter, so he was reasonably taken aback. Eventually, he said in a low voice, "So this is your true power." Sunny, who had been busy loading and firing 12 massive cannons of his own creation, gave him a sideways glance. "Technically, this is 1/3 of 5/7 of my true power. But it is close enough, I guess." Slowly, Neve's gaze turned subtly bitter. Looking away from the furious battle raging on the distant bridge, he sighed. "In the past, I've often wondered how things would have been different if the House of Night had managed to produce a sovereign. What would have happened if Nightwalker was still here?" Sunny smiled faintly. "I think you got it all wrong. Great clans do not produce sovereigns, it's the opposite. Sovereigns produce great clans. So, in a sense, the House of Night was the most impressive of the great clans, because you achieved that title without being supported by a supreme." Neve shook his head. "We were still wiped out, in the end. Even if we weren't, we were destined to fade into obscurity as valor and song conquered everything." He remained silent for a while, then looked at Sunny and asked, "What does it feel like, to wield the power akin to a deity?" Jet, who was leaning against a wooden beam nearby, smiled. "Yes. What does it feel like?" Sunny did not answer immediately, concentrating on his countless shades, the shadows he was manifesting, and firing the cannons. Eventually, he said, "I guess it makes you feel small." It was not the answer they expected, so both seemed surprised. "Small?" Sunny nodded. "You are both saints, so you should understand. The more powerful you become and the more you learn, the more painfully you understand just how weak and ignorant you are. However, there is solace in anonymity. As a mundane person, you know that there are billions of people who are no different from you. As an awakened, there are hundreds of thousands, at least 100 as a saint. But there are only a few sovereigns. So being weak and ignorant feels much more personal." He paused for a second and then chuckled. But don't misunderstand. It's not all bad. In fact, being a demigod feels great. To be honest, my youth was quite miserable every day, I struggled just to survive. Now, I wouldn't even know how to die. Killing me is strictly a theoretical possibility. Having witnessed the state of the immortal dwellers of the Eternal City, however, Sunny was not as comforted by being nearly unkillable as before. Delphire.net. On the bridge, Saint and her army were steadily making their way to the new island. With the support of the Night Garden, the pressure on her and her troops reduced by a large margin, so large, in fact, that Sunny could shift some of these forces elsewhere. So, he sent fiend and fresh reinforcements to the other two bridges. Most importantly, he released Saint from the embrace of his shadow and sent that incarnation to augment the marvelous mimic, as well. With 3 of his avatars concentrated on the middle bridge, he could unleash the power of the curse and weaken the fallen immortals there better. These bridges were a perfect battlefield for the weakening curse, in fact, because only a limited number of enemies could attack his forces simultaneously there. That allowed him to concentrate the debilitating sorcery of the Shadowbound charm on the foremost enemies, thus maximizing its effectiveness. With reinforcements arriving from the eastern bridge, the situation on the other two had shifted, too. Slowly at first, then exponentially faster, the scales of battle started to tip in Sunny's favor. Once he gained an advantage, it only continued to grow. And before too long, the 3 battles reached their conclusion. Saint, Slayer, and the marvelous mimic had crossed the bridges and entered the 3 islands, leading the Shadow Legion onto their shores. Of course, the conclusion of the battle for the 3 bridges did not mean that all combat ceased. The islands were teeming with horrid, immortal abominations, so the battle continued, even if its intensity lessened. It had simply entered a new phase. The Night Garden had left the wharf, so Sunny saw no need to keep a presence on the island connected to it. Having cleansed it from the abominable immortals, the Shadow Legion abandoned the territory it had previously conquered and advanced northward to 3 neighboring districts of the Eternal City. Each of the 3 islands was larger and more densely developed than the Wharf Island and populated by more abominations, as well. The immortals dwelling there seemed slightly more powerful, with more champions akin to the abhorrent Silver Tiger hiding in their midst. One of the islands seemed like a residential area. One resembled a leisure district with vibrant shops and theaters scattered among peaceful alleys, while the last one was mostly taken up by an exquisite park. Beautiful trees rustled quietly in the nebulous darkness, their silver leaves glistening in the rays of falling light. Ponds and winding canals rested under the black abyss of the watery sky above, and tall hills rose above the landscape, cascading toward the promenades built along the edges of the island. Saint and her army invaded the leisure district. Slayer led her bestial force into the residential one, while the marvelous mimic entered the park. Each of the 3 forces was met with its own set of challenges, dictated both by its composition and the terrain of the 3 battlefields. The nature of the battle kept changing, and Sunny had to adapt swiftly. His legion was facing a far greater number of enemies now, so its numerical advantage did not play a large role anymore. The dream curse was not spreading among the restrained immortals fast enough either, and Sunny did not have enough shades to keep restraining them indefinitely, so he had to keep releasing captured enemies despite knowing that they would attack him again. Additionally, the 3 islands were not only larger and more populous than the first one, they were also connected to more districts of the Eternal City, which meant that many new abominations were already trickling across the wide chasms dividing them. Worse still, they were not arriving only from the north, but threatening to flank Sunny's forces on the residential and leisure islands. Things did not look too good for the Shadow Legion. However, the most important change in the cadence of the battle was a positive one. Sunny had not noticed it during the battle for the Wharf Island since it was relatively short and had been fought on a smaller scale than these 3 terrifying collisions, but even the sorcery of the Eternal City was not omnipotent. The fallen immortals of this sunken hell could not be destroyed, indeed. Even if they were torn apart or burned to ash, the Eternal City would restore their youthful bodies to pristine condition endlessly, no matter how many times they perished. However, the time it took the immortals of the Eternal City to be revived varied. At first, it only took them mere seconds to rise again, but if the same nightmare creature was killed repeatedly, that time slowly increased. Already, some of the immortals whom the Shadow Legion had fought on the bridges spent entire minutes remaining dead. That was still incomparable to the silent shades of the Shadow Legion, since the more powerful of them needed entire days to return to the battlefield. However, it introduced an entirely new dynamic to the battle for the Eternal City, giving Sunny more tools to work with. SS? The fallen immortals seemed to be slowly growing wary of the Shadow Legion as a result, not because they feared being destroyed by the Shades, but because they feared remaining dead for too long and surrendering their chance to eviscerate the adversary to someone else. So, the intestine of the combat lessened, somewhat, and it would probably keep changing as Sunny killed more nightmare creatures over and over again, slowing down their revival process. In these circumstances, the ruthless economy of battle had become even more important, forcing Sunny to concentrate on a particular aspect of warfare, the use of siege engineering and fortifications. Like a general commanding an army, well, an actual general commanding an actual army, rather. He had to conquer optimal positions on each of the 3 islands, entrench his forces, and slowly chip away at the swarm of immortal abominations. That was his priority at the moment. Luckily, Sunny possessed a unique advantage as far as fortifying battle positions went. In the leisure district, Saint and her army fought their way to a large structure that made him shudder, in secret, because of its similarity to the Colosseum of the Kingdom of Hope. It was a vast theater built in an elliptical shape, with towering walls with open arches and lavish spectator seats descending toward a wide track that circled the arena, a hippodrome, if he was not mistaken. The open nature of its walls made the hippodrome a hardly defensible position, even if its great size and overall shape made it perfect for establishing a stronghold. As Saint and her warriors poured into the ancient theater, the shadows around it stirred and flowed upward. They filled the wide portals cut into the walls of the hippodrome and then solidified, closing them. At the same time, a layer of manifested shadows reinforced the stone walls, making them harder to destroy. Wide battlements with protruding bastions were established on top of the walls, and an inclined palisade of sharp spikes rose from its base, making approach more difficult. Sunny was already straining himself to maintain the countless chains that bound the captured immortals, so he simply manifested these shadows permanently. That made them far less potent and far more brittle, but by overlaying multiple layers of manifested shadows on top of each other, he was able to vastly improve the resilience of the hippodrome. Remembering the many sieges he had ever participated in, Sunny implemented every measure he could realize in a short amount of time to make the ancient theater as difficult to conquer as possible. Soon, a dark fortress towered above the leisure districts, bristling with countless black spikes. Saint stood atop its walls, shrouded in a mantle of darkness. Similar things were happening on the Park Island and the Residential Island, as well. On the Residential Island, the blizzard summoned by the shadow of the winter beast had swallowed the lively streets, the private estates, and the grove surrounding ornate palatial manors. There was no easily defensible position here, so Sunny had to create one himself. Slayer and her bestial army had taken control of the roofs, with aerial bridges made from shadows connecting them like a web. The obsidian wasps were able to fly, even if they were vulnerable when taking to the air, so they were both highly mobile and unpredictable, giving her a vital advantage. Serpent, meanwhile, was supremely adaptable, capable of supporting any strategy. And then there was the Ember Queen, naturally, the shadow of a great tyrant who was not only fearsome in battle, but also capable of commanding the black millipedes and extremely elusive. On the central island, the marvelous mimic and its defenders had made it to the top of a tall hill, settling there like a natural fortress. Sunny covered his castle in a carapace of manifested shadows, as well, as if dressing it in a suit of armor. There were few terrain features to make use of here, but there was hardly a more tried and tested combination than a steep slope and the walls of a fortress. The sourk of this content is novel-fired, net the only thing he was lacking was a deep moat, but even then, the hill bordered a deep lake on one side. Granted, the immortals of the Eternal City were not going to drown even if they fell into its water. But every advantage, no matter how small, mattered. Here they come. The forces entrenched themselves as best they could, preparing to be besieged. There was no trick Sunny could use, none that was worth the effort, at least so he fully concentrated on his countless bodies, wanting to make the most of his combat skill and intelligence. It was quite fascinating, really. With the mind weave enhancing his mental prowess and the puppeteer serving as the conduit of his will, Sunny had gained nearly flawless control over his shades. That meant that he could not only take full advantage of the rich legacy of tactical warfare accumulated by humanity over the ages, but also perform strategies that mundane generals had never even dreamed of. After all, Sunny had not simply gained the ability to command his dead warriors with the same level of responsiveness as mundane soldiers would have shown. Instead, he could directly control each of his shades so, in fact, the level of cohesion he could achieve was far beyond anything mundane armies had even been capable of. On the most basic level, that was expressed in how well the shades supported each other in combat. The entire Shadow Legion was fighting like one vast, terrifying creature. It was as if Sunny had indeed become a demon with a myriad heads and a myriad deadly hands, sowing death and destruction anywhere he went. Naturally, that made each of the shades far more lethal, while at the same time drastically reducing the losses of the Shadow Legion. On a more elevated level, the unnatural cohesion between the countless shades allowed Sunny to perform strategic maneuvers that had not even been invented yet, since they were simply impossible for armies bound by the limitations of mundane warfare. The fact that he had been able to carve a bloody path to the advantageous locations and fortify them under constant harassment by the fallen immortals was already proof of that. But really, Sunny had not even begun to explore the new horizon of possibilities open to him now, and understandably so. After all, it was not easy to invent an entirely new framework of military doctrines based on a set of realities that could be applied solely to him. The knowledge of military strategy Sunny possessed was the result of thousands of years of accumulated insights and breakthroughs made by genius tacticians, so he could not be expected to accomplish that much in a single day. He was certainly trying, though, driven by desperation and necessity. "I do feel like I'm a little out of my depth." Which was ironic, considering that he was at the bottom of the deepest ocean in the universe. Sunny had commanded a small group of elite soldiers before, as well as a large contingent of the Sword Army in Godgrave. He had also led the Shadow Legion into battle, but never in such an involved and complicated manner. So, he was both struggling and learning a lot, with every second of his endless, intensely violent, and harrowing battle. 3 tides of dreadful abominations descended upon the positions of the Shadow Legion. The violence was unimaginable. Sunny had been disturbed by the monstrous, sinister nature of the first immortal they had met in the Eternal City. Now that this one nightmare creature was replaced by a ceaseless flood of hideous, misshapen horrors, he could not even bother to be repulsed. But nevertheless, he was getting better at commanding his silent army with every moment. With every attack his soldiers received or delivered, Sunny was learning how to wield his power better. His vast mind spun frenetically, absorbing new information and coming to new conclusions. And as a result, the position of the Shadow Legion was slowly improving. On the Leisure Island, the tide of immortals was washing over the walls of the Hippodrome. On the Park Island, the defenders of the Dark Castle had established a killing field on the slopes of the hill. On the Residential Island, Slayer and her beasts were repelling the enemies who leaped or climbed onto the roofs of the few central blocks. And all the while, Nightmare continued to spread the dream curse among the fallen immortals. The Tenebrous Steed was fighting his own battle, as well. The Maze of Nightmares was being destroyed and rebuilt again, slowly expanding as more and more powerful creatures were imprisoned in it. Sunny just hoped that it would endure until the expedition to the Eternal City was over. Sweet dreams, bastards. How are things going there? The Night Garden had moved past the battle on the bridge and was now sailing around an unknown island. The deafening cannonade had ceased, and only the distant echoes of the fierce battle were breaking the tense silence. Sunny was on the bow of the living ship, accompanied by Neve and Jet. Giving the latter a brief look, he sighed. Better than expected, worse than I would have wanted. Despite his best efforts, the Shadow Legion was still suffering casualties. If there was a consolation, though, it was that for every shade that was vanquished, several immortals were infected by the dream curse. The measures Sunny had taken and the fortifications he had built were doing their job. He could not tell if this was enough, though. It seemed like he would be able to conquer the 3 islands in due time while suffering relatively few losses, but would that rate of attrition be acceptable in the long term? There was no way to tell, yet, since the battle for the Eternal City was only starting. Sunny closed his eyes and rubbed his face, feeling as if his mind was on the verge of melting. As I mentioned already, I have established fortified strongholds on each of the 3 islands, for now. Currently, the locals are laying siege to them. Once that chaos subsides a little, I will probably try to accomplish a few secondary goals to gain more advantages. Jet raised an eyebrow. Secondary goals? Like what? He hesitated for a few seconds. I was thinking of trying to destroy one of the bridges. I'll need to find out what hides in the water, as well. The Eternal City used to drift in space, too, so I am sure that there is some kind of underground communications here. I'll need to explore them to see if there are tunnels that can be used to move around the islands rapidly. Oh, but most of all. Sunny turned his head slightly, looking north. When we were approaching the city, I noticed a building that glanced like it might be an armory. It will be great to go on a small excursion and see if I can arm my shades better there. After a short silence, Neve suddenly said in a neutral tone, I don't think that you'll find weapons in that building. Sunny looked at him steadily. Why? Neve lingered for a bit, then shrugged. The locals don't seem like militant people. Sunny blinked a couple of times. He was currently engaged in 3 distressing battles with swarms of rabid locals, so how were they not militant? On the other hand, he somewhat understood what Neve meant. The Saint of Night still explained himself, though. From what I've seen, this place was meant to be a sanctuary. A place of peace and prosperity where even death held no power. In other words, the people living here were not supposed to suffer. Plus, didn't you mention that the Eternal City used to exist in space? An armory suggests the existence of a military force and a need for weapons. Who would the inhabitants of the Eternal City even fight in space, SS? Sunny stared at him silently. Neve was making a lot of sense. To his disappointment. Jet spoke at that moment. Still, that does not mean that there are no weapons in the Eternal City. When Sunny looked at her with a silent question in his eyes, he smiled and shrugged. Well, think about it. If weapons were not used for war, then why would they be used? He tilted his head a little. Was that a trick question? Where did people wield weapons except for the battlefield? Training schools? Or? His eyes glistened a little. Sports? Jet nodded. Yeah. People might become immortal, but some things never change. Sunny hesitated for a moment. Indeed, all he had to do to come up with this answer was ask himself where he had used weapons most often outside the usual battles. And the answer was simple: it was in the dreamscape. People were wired to enjoy conflict and competition, so sports thrived even in war-torn societies, but especially so in those that experienced long periods of peace. In the waking world, the most popular sport was dueling, and since battles between awakened were too perilous, it mostly took place in the dreamscape. Sunny knew better than most how popular these duels were, since he had suffered a lot of unintentional fame as mongrel. The same could be said about all cultures throughout Earth's history. The Dream Realm had not been an exception, either. The immortals of the Eternal City would have been even more susceptible to the excitement offered by sports competitions, since they could not even kill each other. War had been impossible here, or at least meaningless, but the deeply rooted need to experience strife all people shared would have remained. But how am I supposed to find where sports competitions? Sunny fell silent. Wait a minute, hadn't he already found one such place? The Hippodrome? Jet nodded. Chariot races were quite popular in ancient times. I would imagine something similar would have been happening here, as well, considering your description of the local hippodrome. Of course, the races themselves would have been different, with not only people, but also beasts and monsters participating, and everyone in the arena being immortal, gods. I would have bought a ticket if I could. Sunny stared at her for a moment. Instead of answering, he simply commanded his incarnation in the hippodrome to separate itself from Saint, assume a tangible form, and descend to the floor of the arena. Sunny extended his shadow sense into the ground, and immediately sensed hollow spaces there. There was a whole network of service spaces under the hippodrome, rooms for the athletes, stables, training halls, lounges, and equipment storages, as well. Once Sunny sensed what was hidden inside, his eyes glistened. Ah. He lingered for a bit, then looked at Jet with a bright smile. I think I found the first part of that treasure. Without wasting any time, Sunny stepped through the shadow and found himself in a spacious corridor under the arena of the hippodrome. Jet must have been correct in her assumption that mythical beasts had participated in the chariot races held in the Eternal City. The corridor was wide, with high ceilings, and the gates leading to various halls were quite large as well. Sunny could easily imagine a lumbering creature, like the abominable silver tiger he had fought recently, walking on this path on its way to the arena. For a moment, his spirit of exploration flared up, making him space out while imagining the exciting games that had happened in the hippodrome, but Sunny was too preoccupied by something else to let himself go on a mental tangent, not to mention the fact that he was simultaneously controlling countless shades engaged in a furious battle. Walking over to a particular gate, he pushed it open. Inside was a vast hall that must have served as a storage warehouse. The wares stored here were not of a mundane kind, though. Instead, hundreds of suits of intricate armor were displayed on wooden mannequins. The walls were lined with stands that bristled with all kinds of fearsome weapons: spears, swords, axes, mauls, tridents, bows and arrows, javelins, glaives, halberds, anything he could imagine. What was more, those were not ordinary suits of armor or ordinary weapons. Sunny had forged enough of them to know quality when he saw it. Each was worthy of being worn or wielded by a transcendent being, at least. A few, those that were displayed on ornate pedestals, were even fit for a supreme. Both the armor and the weapons were enchanted, as well. Sunny could see a flowing weave of runes etched into the glistening steel, and although he could not tell what enchantments the runes created, he sensed dire power emanating from the ancient blades. Everything here had been preserved in pristine condition, just like everything else in the Eternal City. At least 1,000 sets of armor and twice as many weapons were stored in this hall alone. It was an arsenal that put the armories of great clans to shame. Sunny was suddenly regretful that there were so few human shades in the Shadow Legion. Should he have killed more people, maybe? No. Probably not. But even if he could not bestow these armaments on most of his shades, there were plenty of warriors in the human domain who could benefit greatly from receiving such potent tools. Sunny hesitated for a few moments, then walked over to a pedestal that stood in the very center of the armory, illuminated by an enchanted lantern. There, an imposing suit of lamellar armor that seemed to have been forged from beautiful nacre scales was resting on a mannequin, its head crowned by a laurel wreath. A fearsome spear rested nearby. This set especially radiated a feeling of history and dire power. It had probably belonged to an immortal champion of the eternal arena. Sunny could not help but think that it would suit the Shadow of Dayron quite well, at least during this expedition. It's a pity, though. Most of the shades Sunny commanded belonged to nightmare creatures, so these beautiful weapons and suits of armor were useless to them. He still sent the entire arsenal into his soul sea, though. From there, the best equipment could be summoned to the human shade slayer, meanwhile, would receive full quivers of deadly enchanted arrows. Sunny could not help but think that there had to be a similar arsenal meant for great beasts somewhere in the hippodrome, too. He searched it with his shadow sense, but did not discover anything that resembled gargantuan suits of armor. There was a different point of interest, though. Stepping through the shadows, Sunny found himself in a different vast hall. There, enormous pools of something that looked like mercury were cut into the stone floor, surrounded by runic circles. Sunny studied the pools for a while, wondering what purpose they served. NW novel chapters are published on? He looked around the hall, then considered the layout of the underground complex hidden under the arena. Then, he walked over to one of the runic circles and stared at the runes. Form? Shape? Boundary? Hell, I can't make sense of it. He did have an odd suspicion, though, one that he felt had a good chance of reflecting the truth. Eventually, Sunny stepped back and summoned one of the shades that were guarding the battlements into the underground hall. Soon, an enormous leopard appeared in front of him, towering at least a dozen meters above the floor. Unlike some of the shades, this one was not clad in armor forged by the shadow of the King of Swords, so it was a perfect choice to conduct an experiment. Sunny hesitated for a moment, then commanded the leopard to enter one of the pools. The mercury rippled as the massive beast submerged itself into the pool. Shades did not need to breathe, of course, and the liquid metal did not seem dangerous. Still, Sunny called the leopard back before too long. As the giant shade rose from the mercury, torrents of liquid metal flowed down its black fur. However, not all of that metal returned into the pool. Instead, a layer of it solidified around the body of the leopard. Sunny's eyes trembled a little. By the time the giant beast stepped back onto the cold stones, it was encased in polished armor. The mercury did not just solidify around it instead, it was shaped and guided to turn into an actual suit of armor that was perfectly suited for the body of the bestial shade, protecting all its vital spots while leaving enough open areas not to compromise its mobility. It was incredibly resilient, too capable of withstanding most of transcendent blades, at least, or corrupted claws. Great nightmare creatures would not find it easy to break this armor, either. As Sunny looked at the heavily armored black leopard, his eyes glistened. That's what I'm talking about. While the 3 strongholds of the Shadow Legion were besieged by the flood of grotesque flesh, the Night Garden continued sailing toward the distant lighthouse. Sunny had already begun arming his shades, but it was going to take some time to exhaust the pools of liquid metal and equip as many of them as he could. He moved the shades that had already received shiny new coats of enchanted armor to the front line, though, so the rate at which the Shadow Legion was suffering casualties was already reducing. It's amazing, really. At the moment, Sunny and Jet were with the Saints of Night on the bridge of the living ship. He was showing them one of the weapons from the arsenal of the Hippodrome. I knew that there would be something of value in the Eternal City, but I might have underestimated just how much of a treasure trove this place is. It was inhabited by truly powerful beings, after all, and unlike most other places in the Dream Realm, everything here had been perfectly preserved. The Hippodrome alone can increase the overall strength of humanity by a noticeable margin. Bloodwave nodded somberly, then said in his low voice, 1,000 sets of transcendent armor. All of House of Night only possessed 1/10 of that. Not to mention supreme relics. There were more powerful memories out there now that the number of saints had increased, but it was still an incredible discovery. Even if the artifacts found in the Eternal City were not memories, and were therefore more cumbersome to use, they were a precious commodity. Not only because of their power, but also because of the fact that they were enchanted and the fact that these enchantments had come from a previously unknown tradition. Just like Ananke's mantle had helped Sunny develop his weaving, the runic enchantments of these ancient relics could help human enchanters learn more about sorcery, and therefore push their craft further. Jet whistled, then asked, "Where else do you think we'll be able to find something valuable?" The Hippodrome was an unexpected find, but there were bound to be other similar places in the Eternal City. Neve contemplated for a while, then said tentatively, "Stores?" There had to be stores selling enchanted items. Even immortals would have enjoyed luxury. It would be even better to find workshops where the items were crafted. At that moment, the usually quiet ether suddenly spoke, "Museums. The latest _AP_SODIs are on _the?" He glanced at Sunny and Jet, then added quietly, "People who lived in this city were made immortal, but they had all come from somewhere. The wealth of history they had witnessed must have been immeasurable, and they would have brought mementos of that history here. Since they lived lives of opulence and luxury, knowing no need, they would have enjoyed culture more than commerce." He smiled. "Who knows what we will find in their museums? Relic of the Age of Gods, mythical weapons that decided the fate of entire realms, that is what one imagines when thinking about an immortal abode." Sunny blinked a couple of times. "Museums, huh?" Ether's suggestion was quite plausible, not to mention enticing. Just then, an especially powerful nightmare creature clashed with Slayer, and Sunny got distracted for a while. When the nightmarish horror was finally subdued, he shivered. The more time Sunny spent in the Eternal City, the more a particular question gnawed at him. Glancing at the Saints of Night, he exhaled slowly, and then asked, "Now that I've enjoyed the sights of this lovely city, I wanted to ask. How the hell did Nightwalker escape from here as a sleeper?" Neve and Ether, in turn, looked at Bloodwave, the oldest of them, as well as the person who seemed to have known the legendary founder of the House of Night personally. Bloodwave remained silent for a while, then sighed. "That is Nightwalker you are talking about, the first of the Night Guides. That bastard could find any path and go anywhere he wanted, and nothing could stop him, let alone bar his way. It sounded like Nightwalker had possessed an aspect that had to do with getting places. It also sounded like Bloodwave had not been very fond of the mysterious founder of their clan, for some reason. Ether wore a neutral expression, while Neve's emotions could not be read. Sunny sighed. Well, I'm in no position to judge. Did you know? I once killed a great devil as a sleeper. They chuckled politely, prompting his expression to fall. Ah. It is just not the same without Kai. Soon enough, he winced and raised a hand to shield his eyes. The closer they got to the lighthouse, the brighter their surroundings became. Most of the Eternal City was shrouded in nebulous darkness, with areas bathed in stark silver light. It was a city of endless night, alien to the concept of sunshine. As they approached the lighthouse, however, it was simple to mistake the deep darkness of the undersea for daylight, and Sunny suspected that it would become even brighter as they got closer still. The lighthouse, just like the wharf, was isolated from the rest of the city, standing some distance away from the nearest island. It was a magnificent tower that loomed above the landscape, almost reaching the sloping edge of the invisible dome. Brilliant light spilled from it, suffusing the clouds of vapor surrounding its base with blinding, soft radiance. Sunny had felt nothing when nearing the wharf, but the sight of the lighthouse filled him with awe and dread in equal proportions. He hesitated. I am not sure that we should take the night garden close to the tower. Jet gave him a brief look and nodded. There is no dock, anyway. We will stop at a safe distance away. Neve seemed to agree, as well. How will we get to ground, though? That was indeed a good question. Sunny looked at the turbulent expanse of glistening water and winced. I guess we're going for a swim.